The colors were an important part of the early modern battlefield. They served as a rallying point for massive formations of troops and allowed for officers to quickly identify different units at a distance. Within their respective regiments, the colors also held a powerful symbolic role, almost religious in their nature. They were the physical embodiments of their regiments. While officers and men may come and go, the colors always remained. As you'd imagine, the role of looking after and maintaining the colors on campaign, and even more so of actively carrying them on the battlefield, was a serious and highly coveted responsibility. In this video, within the context of the long 18th century British Army, who was given that responsibility? And what does that role tell us about the life and culture of the Army? But before we come to our topic, a quick word on behalf of this video's sponsor, which if you're a student or an author, an academic or business person of any kind, even if you just have a lot of random ideas throughout the day, it should prove quite helpful to you. Now, you might actually notice that I've got it right here. Maybe not because I'm wearing a black shirt and it's like a dark gray thing, but this little guy is called the Plaud Note Pin. It's an automatic transcriber and a note taker that'll save you hundreds of hours, whether you're sitting in a seminar or attending a lecture, chatting with a client, or just, spitballing ideas to yourself. Plaud will capture whatever audio you need, up to 20 hours worth, and offer you a full transcription and then summary of what was said without the need for manual note-taking. Not only that, but it can then convert that audio into key metrics and topics that were discussed, and even build to-do lists out of all of that material, helping you to retain the big picture without having anything slip from your day. In the case of conversations, for example, once you label a voice within the Plaud app, it will even recognize those voices and label speakers according to their voice print, as it were, helping to ensure clean transcription that's very easy to read through, and you don't have to spend hours parsing through it all and assigning voices and changing minutes and whatnot, right? And then compared with using your phone for the same purpose, you don't have to worry about running out of battery or storage or being interrupted by a phone call, obviously. It can easily be worn with, a clip like I was just before. It can be put onto a wristband or a lanyard. They even have this wonderful magnetic pin, so you put that behind your shirt and then you just clip it right on like that. Plaud also keeps all of your data safe with end-to-end encryption, meeting both EU and US privacy and security standards like the SOC2, GDPR, HIPAA, and EN 18031, which includes using it also for the special Ask Plaud, which is similar to ChatGPT, where it can learn from your message history and better understand your specific needs in using the device. So if you want to use it for helping to draft emails, it can pull data from a meeting for reports. You can help to delegate tasks to team members. Again, making minutes for any sort of like a board meeting, things like that. So if any of this piques your interest and you'd like to learn more about how this little guy, Plaud, can save you both time and boost your productivity, then be sure to follow the link in the description down below. Use my code BrandonF for a special discount. Thank you so much to Plaud for sponsoring this video. Now let's get to the topic at hand. Unfortunately, in the reenactment world, carrying the colors is often treated as an afterthought. They're given to people who want to take part, but can't otherwise run around with a musket or a drum, typically being either too young or too old for the task. But in reality, there was a very specific niche that would be given this task, and they were neither of those things. In the British Army of this time, they were the Ensigns. It's no coincidence that the word ensign itself also means flag or banner. One military dictionary, published in 1778, describes their role as the officer who carries the colors among the foot and is the lowest commissioned officer in the company, being subordinate to the captain and lieutenant. It is a very honorable and proper post for a young gentleman at his first coming into the army. He has the charge of the ensign in battle and is to die rather than lose his colors. If he be killed, the captain is to take them in his stead. Incidentally, that also speaks to just how important the colors were, that it wasn't just any old soldier to pick them up as he happens to go by, but rather the captain himself, despite the requisite danger of carrying them. Although, as well, realistically speaking, you could see how the nearest guy would probably snatch them up before, handing them off to whoever the appropriate authority is to ensure their safety. Now, if you've seen my video about officer roles in this time period, which I'll link below if you haven't, if you'd like more detail, you'll know that, broadly speaking, the ensigns actually had very little by way of formal responsibilities. This was a time period before official training programs for officers. Military academies are really only just starting to become a thing towards the end of the 18th century, and most of their training was being done on the job. In fact, if you look at military manuals and treatises of the time, such as those being written by Thomas Symes or Bennett Cuthbertson, you'll find that most of the requirements these gentlemen suggest for new officers sound more like general character traits in a sort of paternalistic relationship rather than strict job qualifications. Symes even goes so far as to begin his writing on the choice and conduct of an ensign with something of an admonishment for poor parenting. Sounds more like a teacher here than a soldier or an instructional officer. I am sorry to say, he writes, that most parents educate their sons in a profession according to their own inclination, without paying the least regard to what nature designed them for. And how oftentimes we see a parson who would have made a deserving officer, another serving in the army who would have cut a figure in the law. In any case, he describes a good ensign as having courage, a military turn, a good constitution, and serious application, writing that the first object for all young men, and especially for officers, must be, in fact, to make them into good men, just in all their actions, and benevolent members of the universal society of mankind. He encourages young officers to treat their fellows as brothers in common cause, and to obey their superiors with alacrity. Likewise, he urges them against the all-too-common degenerations of gambling, profane vulgarity, drunkenness, and sexual promiscuity. For vice of every denomination is not only contrary to the true sentiments of honor, but even valor, which ought to distinguish the soldier. Bad women and drunkenness weaken the mind, destroy the constitution, and soften courage. And if the understanding loses its vivacity, and the body its vigor, where shall we find the soldier? It's worthy of note that while reenactment societies often have really quite small flags with rather small bodies of troops, in reality, the colors would go with entire battalions, multiple hundred men, and the flags themselves would measure something like 6.5 feet long by 6 feet tall, atop staffs, flagpoles, whatever, that are something like 9 feet in height, I think. They weren't exactly made of this light and easy, airy nylon like the wrinkly thing you hang on your wall. And especially when the wind was up, these things were heavy, and, maneuvering them, even with the fancy belts, it's not exactly an easy task. You can't just give these things to anyone, let alone, like, a 13-year-old ensign or something like that, because he's not old enough to have a musket yet, and expect them to keep up with the rest of the troops. So overall, right, a good ensign is a young man of strong moral principles, good learning, and a sense for advancement and courage. Very important, he is strong, he is hearty, and he is enthusiastic for the service, willing to give his life, and being able to give his life, right, to give it well, being good enough at fighting, without just being cut down right off the bat. He's willing to give his life in defense of that all-important symbol of his regiment and his king, those symbols upon which so much of regimental life was being centered. These things are, they're the lifeblood, they're the heart, they're the soul of the regiment, and men would put themselves in a great deal of harm's way in order to preserve them, or in fact to capture the other guy's sets of colors, right? Ensigns typically have yet, as junior officers, to take on the full responsibilities of a lieutenant or a captain, like leading men into combat. But they're hardly young boys either, still learning the ways of the world. They're also not old men at the ends of their military careers. Now, all that being said, not every ensign was carrying a set of colors. While some armies, like those of the various German states, would have a whole lot of flags for every regiment, the British only had two each. They were the King's colors and the regimental colors. Meanwhile, if you've seen my videos about regimental organization in the British Army, you'll know that there might be something like 8 ensigns per regiment. Now obviously this leaves us with a pretty significant surplus of young officers with no flags to carry. Most of them would merely be advancing alongside the rest of their troops, aiding the other officers in their commands on an as-needed basis, and only occasionally taking command of smaller detachments themselves as required. So how did they decide who of those ensigns had the honor and the importance of actually carrying the colors? Well, again, this is a very important role. It's a big way for these young officers who otherwise don't have much to do to set themselves apart from the rest, win some preferment for themselves in the eyes of their superiors. After all, the colors and their bearers were often pretty major targets for opposing troops, so being willing to stand up with them, big deal. Well, throughout the early modern era, different regiments could have different ways of deciding who would be given that coveted role. It's not always very clear. Some might decide based on merit or enthusiasm, but for most regiments, it seems like the responsibility would be going to the two senior-most ensigns, they being the most experienced of their rank and the soonest to gain promotion out of it to some real responsibilities as lieutenants. But of course, it was also a very situational matter, depending on the individual context that any given regiment was facing. For example, during the American War of Independence, where the British often faced rather severe manpower shortages, which included their officers, you might see NCOs carrying the colors instead. At the Battle of Camden, Sergeant Roger Lamb was given that responsibility for his regiment, the 23rd. In fact, during the American War, the British often wouldn't carry their colors into battle at all, owing to a combination of broken terrain, overall much smaller armies actually fighting each other, a lack of heavy cavalry, a lot of other different factors, but entire battalions, for those reasons, were very rarely being deployed in America as singular formations like they would be over in Europe. Instead, troops are often fighting in much smaller units and in a more open order, what might be loosely described as light infantry style. And so because of this, as historian Matthew Spring describes in his book With Zeal and with Bayonets Only, it's one of my top recommendations, incidentally, for those reasons, the colors were often left behind in storage with the rest of a regiment's heavier baggage, rather than risking them in battle, when tactically they weren't necessary, as it were. There are, of course, plenty of exceptions to that rule, with much more to be said on the topic, for which purpose I'll link the book down below if you're interested in it. Likewise, because of previously mentioned officer shortages, ensigns who would otherwise be carrying the colors might instead be given far more immediate opportunities to prove themselves, including leading units into battle directly. Overall, as we get through the 18th and further into the 19th century, we find that the tactical value placed upon the colors is slowly declining, while their cultural value only ever increased. And to this day, the religiosity of the colors remains fully intact, while obviously they aren't quite so vital in actual combat. Similarly, the ensigns themselves were steadily over time given more responsibilities both on and off the field, thus allowing them more opportunities to prove themselves without necessarily standing to the colors until their dying breaths. As early as 1801, then, so again the very start of the 19th century, another military dictionary describes how the officer who carries the colors is now the youngest of his rank. Formerly it was otherwise, when from the nature of making war, the loss of such a standard was of more fatal consequence than at present. In taking a broad view, then, the person who would carry the colors on an early modern battlefield would be a junior officer as young as 16 and presumably no older than his early 20s. He would be strong, virile, and eager to prove himself to the extent that he would alacritously defend his colors to the death. Is alacritously a word? It should be a word. It sounds like a good word. He's going to be willing to carry those colors to his death. He wouldn't be too young to carry a musket, but instead he's actually going to be an expert, presumably, in many military matters, including the basic drill, and be expected to keep up with the continuous developments in military science. He is an officer and a gentleman. Even if an officer in training, there's still a standard to be maintained there. Nor would he be an older officer that's ready for retirement, but is actively seeking advancement and using his carrying of the colors, among many other things, as opportunities to demonstrate his readiness for that advancement, his zealotry for his corps and whatnot. He's only effectively at the start of his military career. In short, unfortunately, the ensign should be rather the opposite of what we normally see portrayed in reenactment. Even I would be too old to realistically portray an ensign at this point. Of course, that said, most reenactment groups are nowhere near large enough to justify having an ensign anyways. It's much better to keep your regimental colors for static displays and only really bring them into the field if you're playing with a few hundred others and everyone's agreed, right, this is the regiment we will officially portray, and then you can have a set of colors in the field. Again, assuming it's appropriate to the circumstances of what you're portraying. American War of Independence, usually leave them behind. Anyways, these are all of the generalities. And as we get to more specific circumstances, well, that's where we find a lot more variation on who is carrying the colors, how and when, even if they are present at all. And that's the great thing overall about history, is that there's always more to learn. Videos like this should really only represent the beginning of your research, not the end. And to that point, if you'd like to read any of the sources that I've mentioned in this video for yourself, other than Zealand bayonets, which is a secondary piece of scholarship, well, you'll find all the primary sources linked free of charge via the digital library over at www.nativeoak.org. Likewise, I've got tons of videos on subjects like the colors themselves, what made them so important and the like. I've got videos on officer roles in this time period, on regimental organization, on how soldiers were trained, plenty of others as well, all of which, if you'd like to enjoy a more guided learning experience, just go to the channel, you'll find it all right there. I'm sort of falling off of my script a little bit, but thank you all for watching, especially to those of you who support my content on Patreon, because without your support, none of my work would be possible. So until the next time, my dear viewer, I am, and I shall remain, your most humble and obedient of servants.